Hello and welcome to another Smaulgld live stream. Tonight is Monday. It is December 3rd, 2018. Tonight's topic, dollar collapse. China to crush the dollar. Game over. Yes, indeed, we're going to be discussing the status of the dollar. And we're going to look at some of the recent events. We're going to talk about the BRICS and how they've had it with the dollar. We're going to talk about Belt and Road. We're going to talk about China and the deal with the United States, perhaps to call off the tariffs. But first, let's take a look at what happened in the gold, silver markets, the equity markets. Well, the Dow Jones, NASDAQ, and S&P had big days today, and that was a result of an announcement this morning that China and the United States had somewhat called off their trade issues for about 90 days, and there's some information about reducing tariffs eventually, immediate changes that are going to be made. We'll get to those in a second. But as a result of that announcement, the Dow Jones rose 287 points to 25,826. The NASDAQ up 1.5%, up 110 points to 744.1. And the S&P 500 rose 30 points to 2790. Now, over on the gold, let's see what happened in the gold markets as a result of this big day on Wall Street. Now, generally, when Wall Street rises, gold doesn't do too well. Gold has been rising when we've had those big falls in the Dow Jones, NASDAQ, and S&P. So let's take a look at gold. Well, gold had a pretty decent day. Went up more than just a little bit. It went up about $8, and it closed around $12.30. And in the aftermarkets, it's still about $12.30. That's about 0.66% gain on the day. Now, silver had a better day. Generally, when the two of them have gone up recently, gold's gone up more, and then when they've gone down, silver's gone down more, so that's really hurt the gold-silver ratio. But today's a rare day where silver actually outperformed gold. Not too hard to do. Rose 15 cents. That's good for over 1% gain. When you're at $14.15 and you rise 15 cents and you close at about $14.39, well, you gain 1%. Not a bad day for silver, and let's see what that's done to the unsustainable gold-silver ratio. The one that should be 16 to 1, 9 to 1, 1 to 1, because silver is rarer than gold. And all of that stuff, that is all I need to know. Yep, gold-silver ratio went down a little bit. Still over 85 to 1. And it closed at 85.68 to 1. Far from the 16 to 1, 9 to 1, 1 to 1. Oh, now we've got to take a look at our cryptocurrencies. They're taking a beating. Yes, they are. They're right back down to where they rebounded from a few days ago. Looks like the Bitcoin fell under $4,000, and that's now at about 38.33. It's down about 6%. It had been down even further during the day. It had been down to about 3,700 or so. Same with Litecoin had also fallen over 10%. But right now it's at 30.77, down just 7%. Ethereum down only 5% at $108. Bcash at 157, down 7%. But we've seen a bit of a rebound in Bitcoin back to 38.66. It had been as low as about 37.10 or so. Ethereum Classic really taking a beating, down to 453, down 11.02 cents. All right, Smaulgld mug stacking game changers. Let's get to the topic about dollar collapse. China to crush the dollar, and it's game over. Uh-oh, we got a moron here.
Presenting the distinguished international news commentator and foreign correspondent.
This has been an extraordinary week in world affairs.
No, I told Hillary Clinton that that's moronic.
Speaking of Bernie Sanders, I saw today he's getting ready to announce
that he's gonna run for president again in 2020.
Yep,
The 1% are shaking in their boots.
they're going to be really nervous because he and about 27 other Democrats are all going to run for the Democratic nomination. But let's get into the collapse story of the day. That's what we're about here. Dollar collapse and all types of game-changing things that might be happening. Now, we've all heard the dollar's days are numbered. End of the petrodollar. The BRICS have had it. They're going to crush the dollar. They're going to work with China and Russia and India and South Africa, and they're just going to crush the dollar. And then there'll be end of dollar hegemony, and they're all going to lead us to a golden future. And then don't forget the Belt and Road. China's got the Belt and Road going on. Well, a lot of things have happened, and people are really still stuck on this narrative. What's really interesting is this narrative was concocted 10, 15, 20, 30 years ago, mostly by gold pumpers, as a pitch to sell you gold because the dollar is going to collapse and you wanted to be holding on to gold. Very interesting. Of late, you now see Bloomberg, AP, CNBC, all the mainstream media companies all talking about end of dollar hegemony and dollar collapse and China's going to move on the dollar. We're seeing a lot of that, and that coincides with Trump getting elected. But a lot has happened since the story of dollar collapse and end of the petrodollar. Most recently, we've had a change in one of the BRICS. We now have Tropical Trump in Brazil. We have Bolsonaro, and he is very much pro-United States. And China's worried that Tropical Trump may throw a monkey wrench in this big BRICS alliance, which really isn't that strong of an alliance. It's more of a Goldman Sachs acronym. I mean, India has got some serious border issues with China up on the north. They're going to have problems with China because there's resources up there. South Africa, I don't know what benefit it is to be in an alliance with South Africa, but they add the S to the BRICS, so you got Brazil for the B. Then you got Russia. Russia's historically a foe to China. They have moved as close as they've been probably in hundreds of years, but that could be a tenuous relationship as well. India, we mentioned, also has relations, very strong relations with the United States, and indeed is part of an organization called the Quad, which is made up of the United States, Japan, Australia, and the United States. And the goal of that is really to counteract the Belt and Road. And they've had some success because a lot of the Belt and Road projects have been canceled in Malaysia, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, and others. They're concerned that the deals are not good. And the Belt and Road is essentially an extension of China's domestic Ponzi scheme where they overbuild and hope at some point the projects turn a profit. And if they don't, well, there's GDP and they can continue to build more. Now, when we talk about the petrodollar, a lot of people talk about the petrodollar as if it's a stagnant thing and it has the same significance it has had when it was first introduced. Briefly, the petrodollar was the way that the United States managed to pull a fast one and the Bretton Woods Agreement, which was the agreement whereby in 1944, countries agreed that the dollar would be the reserve currency for international trade and holdings and would be backed by gold. We talked the other night the difference between the Bretton Woods Agreement dollar standard and a classical dollar standard, whereas in the classical dollar standard, every country has their currency pegged to gold. In this dollar standard, I call it less of a gold standard, under Bretton Woods, the countries that acquired dollars, not the individual people, but the central banks that acquired dollars in trade, could bring them to the United States and they could be convertible into gold at $35 an ounce. And that was essentially a dollar standard. And Nixon realized in 1971 that after a decade of spending and trade deficits, spending on welfare, warfare, they introduced the Great Society, Lyndon Johnson, 1965. They escalated the Vietnam War in 1965, sending 500,000 troops there. They were moving on the space race. They were building missiles, rockets, all types of spending. And Germany, Switzerland, and France especially grew concerned that the U.S. may not be able to meet its gold obligations. And they were right, but the last few years of the Bretton Woods agreements, they were coming to collect their gold for their dollars. And then Nixon finally shut them down and said, don't come here anymore. You can come here, you can visit, but you're not going to get any gold if you bring your dollars. You'll just have to spend them in the United States like everybody else. And that ended the dollar as backed by gold, and it led a lot of people to believe that this would take away the dollar's reserve status. After all, the major trading partners in the U.S. at the time were Europeans. They had the bulk of the world's production and money outside of the United States, and they were hopeful that maybe the U.S. would go back on the gold standard, and then they were thinking, well, if they don't, we might as well just use, they didn't have the euro at the time, they had individual currencies, the Deutschmark, Italian lira, Spanish peseta, British pound, Swiss franc, French franc, and so on, that maybe they wouldn't need to have this reserve currency and that they could just use their internal currencies. And that's until Kissinger and Nixon figured out they can go to Saudi Arabia and some of the other Gulf states and say, look, we know you're worried about Russia, or at the time Soviet Union. We'll protect you, and what you got to do is price your oil only in dollars and sell it only in dollars. And that created a demand, an artificial demand, because it wasn't because you had gold backing, but it meant that you had to accumulate dollars, at least for the purposes of buying oil, and oil was a big portion of international trade at the time, and that somewhat re-solidified the need to hold dollars, although the U.S. went through an extraordinary period of inflation as a result of essentially defaulting, reneging on their obligations to convert the dollar into gold as requested. And by 1979, the dollar was in such a mess, and there had been 7 or 8 years of really bad double-digit inflations in some of those years. U.S. was issuing bonds. They were called Carter bonds. They were Swiss denominated, similar to the way you see a lot of emerging market countries issuing dollar-denominated bonds. The U.S. was issuing Swiss-denominated bonds because they weren't certain of the value of the dollar. Long story short, that did, however, create not value for the dollar, but demand for the dollar. And then Volcker, the Fed chair at the time under Carter, and then into the Reagan administration, got very aggressive, raising interest rates, took them up almost to 20%. Inflation went down. You had the Reagan boom years. And then we carried on. And the dollar got very strong during the Reagan years. And countries began to accumulate dollars and trade in dollars and continue to trade in dollars to this day for oil from Saudi Arabia. But a lot has changed since then, as the dollar reserves of these countries have become much greater, not just the currency dollars, but their holdings of U.S. treasuries as a form of holding dollars, which is U.S. debt that's issued. And they have far in excess today U.S. dollar reserves and U.S. treasuries, and they need just to buy oil. So the idea that somehow the oil, which I think it's anywhere between 8 and 15, 20% of international trade, it's not the only reason to hold dollars. They hold dollars for other reasons because it's the most liquid, now that they've been trading them for 40, 50 years in this fashion since the end of Bretton Woods. All countries trade in dollars, have dollars, want dollars, need dollars, and emerging markets issue dollar-denominated debt. So there's a great demand for dollars, far in excess of just what you need to buy oil from Saudi Arabia. A lot of people have been saying, well, Saudi Arabia is going to crush, they're going to get away from the United States, and they're going to go to China and the petro yuan and all that stuff. Well, that's not true. We saw that with the murder of the somewhat journalist Muslim Brotherhood guy Khashoggi, there was a great international outcry in the U.S. What are you going to do about it? And what was Trump's response? We're not going to do anything about it. He said, quote, "It's a mean and nasty world out there, the Middle East in particular. This is a long and historic commitment," referring to Saudi Arabia, and one that's absolutely vital to America's national security. Secretary Pompeo, I agree 100%. And in addition, many billions of dollars of purchases made in U.S. big jobs and oil. So essentially, the relationship between the United States and Saudi Arabia, if indeed that's what has to underpin the petrodollar, is probably stronger than ever, especially with the United States canceling the Iran deal. Now, Iran and Saudi Arabia, they don't like each other. One's Shia Muslim, the other is Shiite, and they don't like each other. And the United States has clearly sided with Saudi Arabia. Now, in addition to that, Saudi Arabia is no longer the world's largest oil producer. That is now the United States. Now, they may be the world's largest or second largest oil exporter, and the United States is now exporting a lot of oil too. But the United States also exports a lot of coal and a lot of liquid natural gas. So if indeed countries need dollars to buy oil from Saudi Arabia, well, they also need dollars to buy oil from the U.S. They need dollars to buy oil, liquid natural gas, and eventually coal from the United States. So the idea that the petrodollar is doomed and it's game over and game changer, it's pretty much outdated by recent events and events over the last 20 or 30 years. Now, there is a growing number of countries, but they're enemies of the United States, that are against the dollar. Okay, so Iran has had it. Okay, they've had it, but the United States has had it with them too. Guess who wins in that battle? It's not Iran, it's the United States and its allies. Then this nonsense with the BRICS we've already talked about. Brazil, the other day, it was very interesting, was their new diplomat, I forgot his name, but he claims that climate change is a Marxist hoax, and he joined Trump in dissing the Paris Accord. So you clearly can see this nationalistic bent of Bolsonaro, tropical Trump, and they are siding together, and I don't think that Brazil's got any interest in crushing the dollar. This, I think, is stuff that people, they make up these stories that they say Brazil wants to do this and China is going to do that because they've had it, as if they're in the planning sessions and they know all this, and they just assume that you're going to think, oh, they know what they're talking about. These guys are going to crush the dollar. It's not it's in no one's interest to crush the dollar. And in fact, if you believe that fiat currencies are not sustainable, well, you start with the ones that are the least sustainable. That's not the dollar. The dollar is the most sustainable of all the fiat currencies. Most of the weaker currencies are 100% dependent upon dollars to finance their activities. Even China, they have over-exaggerated China's dominance because they produce a lot of stuff, but a lot of it they produce based on debt, and debt that'll never be repaid because they overproduce goods, they overproduce infrastructure, and a lot of people say, well, that infrastructure is worthwhile. No, it's not. If you build infrastructure that has no use, it's not a potential asset, it is a liability because you incur debt to build it, and it doesn't produce any income. Well, but in a collapse, it's worse. That means it's even further from ever being used, and you have to maintain this stuff. Now, if you are the promoter of a bridge and you borrow money to build it and no cars ever pay tolls on it, and then there's a collapse and the plans of anyone ever going on that road get pushed out 5 years, you still owe money on your bank loan and you still have to keep it up. You have to pay taxes, you have to pay maintenance. So I don't understand how that is in any way, shape, or form an advantage to have built stuff that no one needs. But in any event, they've given this mythical power, and Sun Tzu says it's in a way to make it sound like China's your gold buddy because they produce a lot and they somehow have this voracious appetite for gold, and then they're going to roll it out into a stadium and it's going to be game over. They're going to crush the dollar and so on. Now, we're not seeing that at all. No, China's plan is not based on acquiring a lot of gold. that's only how people who are interested in gold look at it. Their plan is to try to generate enough GDP, enough economic activity to create enough work for 1.4 billion people and keep them fed and from rioting. Their goal isn't to accumulate a lot of gold and then rub the United States nose in how much gold they have and tell them you don't have any, so we win because we have more gold than you, and he who has the gold rules. That's the golden rule. That's I don't even know. That's like fantasy talk. That's not going to do China any good to do that, especially with the amount of trade that they have with the United States. And also, when people talk about China, they don't realize that China has a bigger debt problem than the U.S. has. They have unfunded liabilities. They have old people they're going to have to take care of. They've got a lot of social issues there as well. But they don't have the advantage of being able to print yuan and export that yuan because no one wants it as a reserve asset. It's held, I think, as a percentage. It's been under 2% for at least the last 7 years. It hasn't really increased as a percentage of reserves of national banks. Countries do not want to hold the yuan. They know it's subject to devaluation. If you think people can't trust the U.S. numbers, you certainly can't trust the Chinese numbers. They have capital controls. It is just not a good currency right now, and no amount of gold is going to change that. And I'll give you an example. Today we were talking about, I released a quick video on the Kazakhstan gold reserves. Now, Kazakhstan has been on a gold buying binge. They've bought gold 73 months in a row. Gold now is 46% of their reserves. In fact, Kazakhstan has bought so much gold in the past few years, they are now a major gold holding nation. Here is the top 20. Take a look at this. Here's the top 20 gold holding nations. When I say gold holding nation, I mean the central banks. Kazakhstan is ahead of Saudi Arabia, the United Kingdom, Spain, Lebanon, Australia. And if they keep up this pace, they'll be in the top 10. Well, you think, well, that's great. That means that Kazakhstan must have a strong currency. Wrong goes star. They do not. In fact, the reason they buy gold makes sense is because they have a very crappy currency. There's the Kazakhstan tenge. And you can see that gold has gone up 2.5 times against it. And it makes sense that every ounce of gold, or nearly 70%, 75% of the gold that they mine in their country, they don't sell on the open market. They slap it right into their central bank. Makes total sense. Otherwise, if they were holding Kazakhstan tenge, they would lose their reserve value. This way, they preserve the reserve value. They don't have to deal with buying U.S. treasuries. They don't have to deal with anything. They just have to deal with their miners and put that gold in. But you look at that. That is, as they add gold to their reserves, it doesn't help the currency one bit. Okay, so also, here's the thing I wanted to mention. India and China will clash in the Indo-Pacific region, says this Bloomberg reporter from today's perspective. That seems like a most likely scenario. So the idea that the world is somehow teaming up in this mythical entity called the BRICS, it's not a legitimate threat. It really isn't. The U.S. is on friendly terms with Brazil, on friendly terms with India, and is going to be on friendly terms with China in some respect, given what we see, some of the preliminary, I don't know how much you can trust these, but we'll go through what they say they have agreed to tentatively, why China would want to crush the dollar. It doesn't make any sense. They're all on a fiat currency system. No one benefits, as we talked about the last couple of nights with the gold standard. No country would benefit by tying its hands to a gold standard, especially if the other countries didn't do it. Why? Because then they couldn't print money in emergencies. They couldn't promise things to their constituents. China is the last country that would ever want to restrain itself with a gold standard. That's why that whole gold-backed yuan game changer was dead on arrival when I first heard that story. But that didn't stop. Every gold pumper, every gold channel out there from touting that story, petro yuan, gold-backed yuan, game changer, end of dollar hegemony, multipolar world, all these buzzwords that are supposed to get you excited so you run out and buy gold, because China is smart. They are buying gold too. Central banks are buying gold. That is all I need to know. And you hear these stories over and over again. And it's not really based on analysis. It's wishful thinking, or it's based on cherry-picked facts that aren't really facts. But here's an interesting, I mentioned, here's CNBC. Now they're all getting into the Sun Tzu stuff themselves. Whenever they say experts say or sources say, it's just they made it up. Or the expert is just some guy who just happens to have a blog. Or some guy who happens to have an opinion and has held it for 10 years. And because he says, I've always said, well, then somehow that means it must be true because he's always said it. But this particular article says that experts say, China, trade war or not, experts say China's yuan is poised to become the global heavyweight. Now, they've been saying that for 6 years. And China itself, if you read some of the documents, has said one of its goals, not its primary goal, one of its goals is the internationalization of the yuan, and they expect it could take 20 to 50 years. Okay, so their primary goal isn't to crush the dollar and have the world's global currency and go stomping all over the United States, sprinkling gold dust on everybody. It's nuts to even think that the reason they don't want to internationalize the yuan too fast is they don't want the restraints that come with it. They want to have capital controls if they want to implement them. They want to be able to base the yuan if they have to do it. They want to be able to lie about their non-performing loans if they have to lie about them. Why? Because they need to be able to do, as I said, their goal is to keep the economic engine going so that their people are employed and fed. Their goal isn't because they're pissed off and they're mad and they've had it and they're going to crush the dollar. That's not analysis. That's childish talk. To say that China's going to act in that fashion. They're going to roll their gold out into a stadium. That's what they're going to do. That's real Sun Tzu. It's ridiculous to even think that way. Okay, so that's CNBC talking this Sun Tzu nonsense, experts say. And then we also had, here, this one's in Bloomberg. And this is clear. They never used to talk like this. Bloomberg. The EU is set to unveil plans for challenging the dollar's dominance in global markets. Now, the EU is probably in a much better position to challenge dollar hegemony than China is, that's for sure. But the EU's got its own problems. Its issues are staying together. Now look at Macron. He's got those climate change riots going on. You got Italy with Salvini complaining about the migrants. You got Britain with Brexit, but they're not part of the euro. But still, you've got Poland complaining. You got Merkel on the outs. That's not an area of unity and solidarity where they can join together and crush the dollar. Again, but not as many. The gold pumpers don't generally point to Europe. But now we're seeing the mainstream media all talking about end of dollar hegemony. And clearly this started when Trump became president, because you never used to see this before. This was never part of the narrative of the mainstream media. Narrative of the mainstream media was always whatever was happening that Obama was doing was fine and there wasn't an issue. All right, let's take a look now what happened and what is happening with the tariffs and trade. And this is what drove the markets today. First, let me just check to see what the game changers are up to in the comments section. Let's see what the mug stackers are doing here. All right. Oh, we got a lot of them here. All right. We got many of all of our regulars here. Persanti Girl, Mate, Pablo Pena. Okay, well, you're all there. Yeah, I'll get to all these comments. So make sure there's nothing going on I need to be aware of. Sometimes, for those of you who are new to this channel, what happens is I'm talking and the YouTube will cut the feed. I don't know who cut. I don't cut the feed. The feed gets cut, and people who are on this channel know happens all the time, and I have to keep toggling back and forth to make sure nobody's saying, hey, we lost him. So far, we've been lucky. Hasn't happened. All right, let's talk about what's happened, what they reported on, what's happened with China and the announcement that came out today. Okay, so Trump had been saying, look, China, you've been ripping us off for years. That's been his whole shtick that he's been saying. and that he wants China to lower their tariffs, or he's going to raise tariffs. So he put tariffs on Chinese goods, I think it was about $250 billion. And then he said, look, I'm going to put another $200 billion on, and I'm going to raise tariffs on existing products. And China, in retaliation, had put tariffs on U.S. cars. They rose it from like 25% to 40%. And a lot of people, essentially, your never Trumpers, Democrats, mainstream media, free marketeers, they all basically had a reason to be against Trump starting this trade war. And one of the easiest arguments against a trade war is there's a lot of cliches. No one wins a trade war. You're punishing yourself when you do a trade war. Tariffs are never any good. Okay, I always understood that, and I've never been for tariffs. I believe in the free market. When you have no tariffs, when countries trade freely, it generally is a reallocation of the global resources. It's typical if you can make oranges in Florida better than you can make them in New Hampshire, then you let the people in Florida make them, and you don't buy oranges from somebody who's growing them in a greenhouse in a snowstorm. And globally, if you have free trade, you will find that countries that are the best at what they do, then you want to import those products from those countries, even if your country doesn't make them. That's the idea of the whole wealth of nations, free trade, and so on. Even I'm not going to get into mercantilism. But in any event, what a lot of people thought was, well, what is Trump doing? He's destroying this new world order that we have. And I don't know how anyone missed this. I mean, it's obvious. It's not like he was putting tariffs on in place in order just to have tariffs. He was using tariffs as a bargaining chip in order to reduce tariffs. I mean, clearly that's what's happening. If you go and you tell a country, hey, it's not a good idea that you got high tariffs on our goods and we don't have high tariffs on your goods, and they say, yeah, that's not a good idea, is it, huh? And you say, well, what are you going to do about it? And they say, well, what do you want me to do about it? Well, we want you to take the tariffs lower on our products. And they say, oh, really? That's nice. Okay. And if you don't say, and if you don't, we're either going to invade you, which is not a good idea, or we're going to put, I mean, the only logical thing you can do if somebody has tariffs on your products and they're not going to change it is to put tariffs on their products coming in. And then that causes them a reaction. They have to rethink, is it worth trying to extract the tariff when we're not going to get the benefit, because when we go to ship stuff to them, they're going to put a tariff on us. It's pretty simple to me. It's not game theory or anything or some type of 4D chess. And it's not an indicator that Trump is like the tariff man. It seems like he wants to get to a point where tariffs are not necessarily eliminated totally, but are fairer in either direction as a result of a negotiation. I think that's all that's happening on here. And so he was threatening to China that on January 1st, tariffs on these accessories and so on, we're going to go from 10% to 25%. Now, China has a problem. We mentioned they got 1.5 billion people, and maybe 400 million have moved into cities in the last 10 years from out in the country. And they were planning with their centrally planned economy and social credit scores and so on that these people would be working, that it all planned. They're going to be making X number of widgets, working 12 hours a day, and they were going to be shipping those widgets to the United States, and then they were going to get X numbers of dollars back, and they had the whole economy planned. And then the U.S. said, well, maybe not, because we're going to put tariffs on your stuff. Then they realized that, maybe 80 million people wouldn't be working then. If that's how they calculate in their central planning, well, that's 80 million people that are a potential problem. They can't have that. Yeah, maybe for a month or two they can. They can't allow that to... So that what they have to do is they then have to reallocate resources or borrow money and to make sure that those people have something to do. Maybe they just keep producing the stuff and then they try to sell it somewhere at a loss. Maybe they're already making a loss on it. Who knows? But the issue that China has is they've planned on all this. The United States economy is much more dynamic because it's not totally centrally planned. And yes, parts of the economy can get hit like the farmers did. But the whole economy is much more dynamic because it's not centrally planned. So apparently what they agreed to was that Trump wouldn't do anything between now and January 1st, which was the threat, the next 90 days, and that they would negotiate technology transfers. One of the big sticking issue is intellectual property for the United States. The other issue is that besides intellectual property, is that China continue to buy agricultural products and also energy, because China is a big energy consumer. China does not have within its means to energize or provide itself with energy. They don't have the amount of oil they need, liquefied natural gas. They have coal, but they do need oil. And of course, they can buy some from the United States, and they had been. And China was becoming a very big consumer of U.S. energy products. So they've reached a deal, and then China said, well, they haven't reached a deal. They've reached an understanding to reach a deal. And then China said, okay, we won't put any more tariffs on your stuff. And then they said they were going to lower the tax on U.S. automobiles, and that's really supposedly going to help General Motors and others who want to export there or not just build there. And then they also agreed, and again, when they say they agreed, this is what's reported, but apparently there's people who have put together charts where U.S. says this is in the agreement, China says this is in the agreement. They both admit certain things, so who knows how this thing is going to work out. Wall Street didn't care. They heard that there was a deal, and Wall Street will use any indication for the equity markets to rise, and they did indeed do that today. So it's basically a truce on the United States side. China appears to have made some concessions on U.S. goods, and they also agreed to buy immediately some agricultural products and some energy products. And Secretary Treasury Mnuchin says this is the first time the U.S. received a commitment from China that there'll be a real agreement. So people are saying, I don't know what they're saying in China, but even the naysayers in America are saying that it seems like Trump is winning this part of the trade war. But we'll see what happens. Now, there had been talk. Trump basically threatened them with Apple, and he said, yeah, okay, well, we can put the tariffs on the iPhones, and that would be a 10% tariff on the iPhones in a few months. And, that might annoy some people, might bother some people a little bit, but that would raise the price of the iPhone, but it looks like that's not going to happen at the moment. So all things considered, it looks like this strategy tentatively has worked. Before I even say that, even since Trump started this, the trade deficit with China has increased. Now, some say that's because a lot of companies are buying Chinese products before all the tariffs click in. Who knows? But I would imagine at some point that that this does lead to better trade between the U.S. and China, perhaps a more balanced trade, which really doesn't hurt China, because I think China had a higher built-in profit margin that they maybe shouldn't have had, and they can, in their centrally planned economy, readjust that. And it looks like the United States will get more agricultural products, more energy products sold to China, and so I don't see, as you tie this back to the dollar, I don't see how this is in any way, shape, or form why it's in anyone's interest to crush the dollar, because the dollar is the linchpin or the lodestar of the fiat currency system, and they're all in on the fiat currency system. The only ones that aren't in on the fiat currency system, they're on the outs, they're on sanctions. Well, of course they're annoyed, and they're going to want to get de-dollarize and all that. But I understand the idea that no one wants to be held captive, but there really isn't an alternative. And you could say gold all you want, but the gold is, as we've seen, such a small portion of financial assets. Oh, but if they revalue gold to 50,000, okay, so when they revalue gold to 50,000, I think people believe that more. They need that more for their own benefit because they want $50,000 gold than they actually think that would make sense in an international international financial system. A lot of people, so they're going to have to bring gold back. I'm not sure why they would. So Trump tweeted out that China's agreed to reduce and remove tariffs on cars coming into China from the U.S. Now, we don't say whether reduce and remove. We don't know to what extent they reduce or remove. He says currently the tariff is 40%. Well, but the tariff had been 25% before he started. Maybe they'll reduce it to 15%. Maybe they'll get rid of it. But again, it's all a negotiation. China to resume U.S. soy imports. So we don't really know what's going to happen here. But one thing I would say is that none of Chinese actions, the goal of their negotiation with the United States is not about crushing the dollar. It's about gaining an advantage and gaining an advantage that helps the Chinese people. It doesn't help the Chinese people to crush the dollar. And I get tired of hearing, I actually get tired of talking about it, but I keep seeing it, multipolar world, SDRs, all this kind of stuff. But I don't see it. I mean, let's take a look and see what you guys think about what's happening. But I just don't see how anything that's been happening recently means that the dollar's days are numbered. The only way the dollar's days are numbered is if you believe the entire fiat currency system's days are numbered. And yes, the whole thing is, quote, unsustainable. It's not, but it's not just the United States. They all have obligations, debt obligations far in excess of GDP, far in excess of tax receipts, far in excess of anything you can imagine. But they all seem to make it work because they all also count a lot of that debt as an asset, which is kind of odd to consider that debt an asset, but that's what they do. So, finally, when there's nothing left and you can't borrow another buck from the state-owned bank or build another bridge to nowhere, you don't bust the joint out. What do? Ask Sun Tzu. I don't know. All right, let's take a look at what you guys have been saying and thinking. Jake Howitzer says, I plagiarized that title from Bull Pony. I got to get the turn dates. I got to subscribe and get the turn dates. Kareem R., long-time subscriber. Only 2 minutes. I can hardly wait. Moments like this make me wish I still smoked. Good time killer. Okay. Roving reporter. Quite a bold statement, Small. Do tell. Well, I think I did just tell. Shanty Girl is here. Kareem says, nice Jimi Hendrix open. I must give a shout out to Mark Battaglia, who is the sole contributor to the Smaulgld opening themes. He has written a number of them. He's Dow 20,000, Bitcoin Blues, Litecoin Charlie, and When Lambo. I think the one we heard open today's show was called Litecoin Charlie. Some excellent writing and playing on all of those things. Mark is also the creator of the concept of Smaulgld being the red pill for the red pilled, meaning that a lot of you have heard a lot of these narratives. They make a lot of sense, these precious metal pumper narratives, but they're incomplete. And it doesn't help just to reject mainstream media narratives and then swallow hook, line, and sinker all these collapse narratives and not stop and think whether you're also receiving somewhat of a skewed narrative. And that was Mark's contribution as well. Aquaculture is back again tonight, as is De La Ville. De La Ville sent me some beautiful pictures of her cute little rescue dog with her Smaulgld mug. Last night we saw Pablo Pina's Doberman Pinscher guarding his Smaulgld mug, and if I get permission from De La Ville in the comments, I will show you her picture as well. Very cute dog. All right, everyone's saying hello to each other here. We've got a crew here that comes every night. And Holloman, you appear to be new. What a title to this. Oh, yes. Oh, apparently the U.S. yield curve just inverted, said Aquaculture. That's never a good sign. Hey, mate is here. Yes, well, Pablo Pena says, I released yesterday was Lucky's first mug shot. Get it? A mug shot. Picture of his dog with a Smaulgld mug. By the way, for you people who are new and don't understand the concepts of mugs as real money and mugs as real wealth, Go to Smaulgld.com and you'll see. Or just go to the Smaulgld channel and listen to the 18 reasons why you should buy Smaulgld mugs. They are indeed game changers. Cryptos are really beaten up, says Ann. Yeah, she's absolutely right. Yeah, everybody's got a prediction. I was looking, it's unbelievable. Last year, 2 years ago, prices were going up. You see Tone Vase, Rao Po, Novogratz. They all got like these 200,000, 40,000, $1 million price targets. And as the price goes down, now they're talking $1,000. It's unbelievable. When the price is going up, everybody says it's going to go higher. And the price is going down, everybody says it's going to go down. No one knows. Although there are some people, you got to give them credit. The permabulls, they're not just going up and going down. This guy Draper, who bought like 20,000, 30,000 Bitcoin a long time ago, he's still saying 200,000 or some very high number by 2022 or something like that. I have no idea. People look at charts, they stand on their head, they make up use cases, they look at hash rates, they look at sentiments, Google Trends. I don't think anyone has any idea what they're talking about. That's why I don't make predictions, especially on Bitcoin. Bitcoin literally could be zero and it could be $1 million. Throw your dart somewhere in the between. All right. Talking a lot about Bitcoin here. I'd back up the truck at $1. I don't think you wouldn't. If Bitcoin was actually $1, there'd have to be something seriously wrong. I think at $1, when it first came out, you might back up the truck. But if it ever got to $1, there'd have to be something seriously damaged. It wouldn't even be $1. All right, what else do we got here? You guys having this big conversation. I'm talking about game changers, and you guys have been talking about Bitcoin. NBC been following Jim Willie. I'll tell you, he has been probably the biggest purveyor of this. The BRICS have had it. China's going to crush the dollar. Germany's had it. Everyone's against Papa Bush and all this stuff. And his videos used to get hundreds of thousands of views. And he imbued them all with that anti-dollar. Fed is never can raise rates. And I think a lot of people, that became almost the standard narrative on all the gold and silver channels, was China to crush the dollar. China's buying gold. China is smart. Central banks are buying gold. That is all you need to know. He was very influential in that regard. All right. Also, there was a lot of predictions. Gold was going to go up and up and up. And I don't think he made these predictions, but there was the gold 50,000 prediction. All these predictions about gold. Silver worse. Biggest wealth transfer this decade from 2010 to 2020. Yeah, only transfer was people sending money to buy gold and silver, to buy silver eagles. Silver's lower than in 10 years than it was 10 years ago. It's unbelievable. All right, commodity. You guys having a great conversation here. All right. Presidents are chosen, not elected, most anyways. That's generally true. And the U.S. dollar was going to for how many years? Waste of time making predictions, mate. It will do what it'll do. That is correct. Prashanti girl, not sure. He thinks it will keep rising for a while. Would love to hear Louis' thoughts on this. Well, I have been looking at the dollar for over 10 years and listening to these dollar collapse, end of dollar hegemony. And I noticed a pattern in the Fed behavior. And a lot of people, I think, this is my view, but they believe, I think Peter Schiff believes that the Fed would sacrifice the dollar for the equity markets. And I think that's absolutely not true. Other people think that the Fed number one goal in life is to protect the interests of its shareholders, the too big to fail banks. I don't think that's the number one goal either. So I don't think the Fed would sacrifice the interests would sacrifice the dollar for the equity markets. I don't think that the Fed would do anything to help the too big to fail banks if it permanently damaged the dollar, because I believe that the dollar is the number one asset of the United States. And they must, and that's what you saw, what they did with the petrodollar. They had to make sure they had a way of keeping interest in the dollar. Prior to that, I did research. When the U.S. was on a gold standard, it was part of the CIA's job, top secret, highly classified, to understand the gold market, because that all impacted the dollar. So the United States takes dollar hegemony very seriously. Doesn't mean that the dollar index always has to be 90 or 100, but it means that the dollar has to be the default reserve currency, has to have demand for the currency. The second biggest asset of, and that's the Fed's job, because without the dollar, you wouldn't have the stock market. You wouldn't have the confidence in the stock market. You wouldn't be able to attract dollars into the stock market. But you can back the dollar and support the dollar. It's a balancing act, and also support the stock exchange. And you can see, one day I did this a while back, I should update it, but I showed how even when the Fed did QE and the dollar got weaker and weaker, that's when they started talking about ending that particular QE. Then they waited, and then the dollar rose, and then they'd announce another QE, the dollar would fall. The longer they did that QE, the dollar would fall more. Then they'd stop it. Dollar would rise again, and they'd keep it within a range. And then when they did QE, they were very smart. They made it bigger and badder than ever, but they immediately started talking about tapering it, even though they kept piling on, it was bigger than ever. And the dollar actually continued to rise. If you look at a chart of the dollar index, I wish I had it for you right now, from the time they started QE to the time they ended it, the dollar index actually rose. Now go figure. You would think that after printing $4 trillion and taking interest rates down to zero, that the dollar index would have collapsed. You had everybody complaining about it, but you see, they're very clever. They're very, very clever. They don't allow this kind of stuff to go out of hand. And they managed to keep the dollar on an even keel. They talked about raising interest rates for 2 years. They didn't do it. Dollar index soared. So I've never believed this stuff, because I don't believe that central banks are impotent. I believe, you see, these people, I think, suffer from cognitive dissonance. They believe that the Fed is evil, and that the central banks are evil, and that they do all these nasty things, and they've got all this control over the world. And then somehow they think they just can't control the dollar, or somehow they can't have 8,000 tons or 4,000 tons in Fort Knox. If the United States entity is as powerful and has the ability to invade countries, destroy countries, print trillions of dollars, then why can't they control the value of the currency? Why couldn't they have 4,000 tons in Fort Knox? It's only worth $160 billion. So I don't go for this. I figure as long as the world is on a dollar standard, and China's playing ball. It's not like China wants to crush the dollar. As long as all countries have a vested interest, even if they don't like it, they still have a vested interest. You may not like your doctor, but if he's saving your life, you have a vested interest in keeping him alive. He's keeping you alive. As long as the world is on a dollar standard and it's working. See, a lot of people say it's not working because they don't like what's happening, but that doesn't mean it's not working in that goods and services aren't being provided, commerce isn't happening. As long as that's all happening, there's no reason to fully attack the dollar. And there's no reason to believe it's going to go away, because gold is not in a position to be a currency the way it once was. Gold right now is in a position to be a reserve asset. And we were talking about this in the comments with Pablo Pena, and we noted that he asked the question, has the value of the Kazakhstan tenge gone higher as they've added gold? And I said, no, it's gone lower. And we see that adding gold to your reserves doesn't make your currency stronger. And part of the reason for that is it's the gold is not the tail wagging the dog, it's the tail. You can go out and buy gold with dollars. There's infinite amounts of dollars that you can use to buy gold. That may raise the value of the commodity price of gold, but gold, you cannot You cannot boost your currency just by backing it with, like, Kazakhstan. It doesn't do any good. All it helps in is if Kazakhstan has a financial crisis, or if they run up a lot of debt somehow and they can't pay it. They can sell their gold, and that's a helpful thing. But that doesn't make it a viable international currency. Now, you could foresee a time where maybe if they wanted to use gold, but I would doubt any of these countries would, you'd have to revalue gold to a ridiculous level. But there'd have to be a major crisis, and we had a major crisis in 2008. And never once did these people think about adding gold into the financial system. What did they do? It's created more debt. So I don't think that there's going to be any type of dollar collapse other than perhaps an entire fiat collapse. All right. Usually Bitcoin goes up when the stock market's up. There, I guess there's somewhat of a correlation there, and that is correct. If Bitcoin rises with the market, it tells you something. It's a speculative trade by people who have wealth. Yes, that's true. But the question is, mate, is it people who have wealth because they already had wealth, or because they have wealth because they have bought Bitcoin? So that's kind of an interesting thing here. All right. Let's see what else we got. All right. There is no markets. Everything is rigged. The algos own the game. Yes. And I would bet some of those algos are government-backed interventions. You know, we know the Swiss National Bank buys and holds shares. We know you got the Exchange Stabilization Fund. Who knows what big entities are doing that type of rigging and it's not, it's funny. People think that only the gold markets are rigged because somehow gold and silver are so important. But I was having a conversation with someone on Twitter. Goldman Sachs, JP Morgan, they've been caught rigging copper markets, zinc markets, aluminum. They rig everything. The only thing that is interesting is that it's very rare when they highlight the gold rigging. They act as if, oh no, they don't rig that. They don't rig the gold, but they do rig everything. Mugs are good, says Ann Holloman. That's right. Trump on Cohen. He deserves a full sentence. That's right. Now he's a bad guy. He's a moron. But yet he was the guy's lawyer, so he doesn't have good judgment in picking lawyers. And Trump on MBS. Boy, it's a nasty world out there, isn't it? Exactly. Oh, well. Let's see what else we got here. Got more comments. La Plata Peak. Chinese Navy might crush a U.S. battleship before the U.S. crushes the dollar. Well, yes, that's possible if the United States were to decide to confront China in the South China Sea. And then, if you have military dominance, that does impact your currency. So that's a good point. Same with the aircraft carriers and all those things out there. My mug is backed by tea, says Pablo. All right. What else have we got here? That's a lot of jokes here. Okay, can't go through them all. Yeah, that's a travesty about Toys R Us 35 years ago. Nothing excited me more than walking into that store. Yeah, when you have kids, you go in there, and what happened is people would go in there and then they go buy this stuff on Amazon. That is the Mattel products. I'll tell you a funny story, and it's my inflation story. I was aware of inflation as a child in 1969, and I think I was in the third grade. And I had quarters, and some of them were silver quarters. I had $45 in a coffee can. I don't know how I got that many, but that's a lot of money for a kid. Must have been my grandmother handing them to me for a few years. But in any event, I had bought a Hot Wheel toy, and I paid 50 cents for it. I think it was off the back of a Hawaiian punch can or something like that. It was one of the foods that used to, horrific foods Hugh would never eat today. And if you sent in like 3 coupons and sent them 50 cents, they would send you this Hot Wheel for 50 cents. And I bought it, and I brought it to school, and a friend of mine wanted it. He wanted to buy it from me, so he was willing to pay me $1 for it. So I took the $1, and then I went home and I threw the extra quarters in my jar, and then I didn't feel any richer, and I thought I wanted the car. So I went back the next day and I said, I want to buy the car back. And I figured I'd give him $1.25, $1.50, he'd take it back. He got me up to $5, and I remember sneaking the quarters into my pocket and going to school that day and paying $5 for it, and then rationalizing it in my mind that by the year 1978 or 79, the car would be worth $5 anyway, and I wasn't getting ripped off. Never told anyone about it. Actually, it's the first time I even mentioned it out loud. And never happened because I was in a store the other day. You can buy 10 Hot Wheels for $5 today. They're made in China. Anyway, that's my inflation story. Silver nickels, silver quarters, and so on. It was prompted by that Toys R Us story. Okay, zero heads. There are new Smaulgld mugs going to 100K. That is correct. Pablo Pina. I'm looking now for the comment from to show the dog. Prashantigo, do you guys think pooled allocated silver with a trustworthy company with no debt is a good option if you don't want to store large amounts or pay for vaulting? I would pay for the vaulting. There's a pooled account by definition means, yeah, it's all there. It's not in your name. If they go bankrupt, then you don't have it. If it's vaulted and they go bankrupt, then supposedly you still have title and you can get it back. So, but there was a guy from, I think his name was Bron Shadicki or something, from Perth Mint, and he worked there at the time, but he said you can allocate some to pooled, not all of your amount, some to vaulted. You know, he had a view on it that if it wasn't just all your money in a pooled account, then he thought it was okay to do that. You would save on some storage fees. There you go, Perth Mint. That's what Mage is talking about. Hot Wheel ads were cool. Yep. Let's see. All right, what do we got here? I want permission now to show that picture. I don't have it. Do I have it? Do I have it? No, I ain't got it. All right. Well, anyway, I want to thank everyone for joining me tonight, and you can join me each and every night. Remember that mugs are stackable, and mugs can never go to zero. So thank you very much, and we will see you tomorrow.